During the Second World War, to defy Adolf Hitler and his regime was incredibly dangerous. Anyone suspected of insubordination or resistance was usually sentenced to death and was executed in brutal fashion. Erwin Rommel was even forced to his death after being suspected of being involved in the July 20th plot. But there was a horrific Nazi prison that was used to take the lives of thousands of people there during the Third Reich and the Nazi era, and it became known as a House of Death. Plotzensee Prison today still has people locked up inside of it, and it's used as a juvenile prison. But during Hitler's time in power, it was a place where heads rolled with the German guillotine, the fallbeil taking the lives of many people. Join us today as we look at the brutal executions of Hitler's House of Death, Plotzensee Prison. Remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Plotzensee Prison was built in the 19th century and was named after the manor and lake nearby in Berlin. During the Weimar Republic before Hitler seized control in 1933, there were 36 executions that occurred there. All of these took place using beheading by axe, which was common during the medieval and Tudor period, and there were some German executioners that were considered skilled with an axe. This was usually a hand axe, but later Hitler saw this as even too brutal, and he had the law changed to use a fallbeil, or the German guillotine. After the Nazis took control, the prison housed regular criminals, and those people who were considered political prisoners. Hitler quickly Nazified the prison system, and housed many people who were considered enemies of his politics, and communists all up and down Germany were being imprisoned. Plotzensee saw communists held there, and it was one of 11 selected execution sites established by Hitler's government and the Nazi Minister of Justice, Frank Gertner, within Germany. It had a full-time executioner whose job it was to take the lives of anyone who was sentenced to death. These dealt with a large amount of condemned individuals during the time period, and they had an increased workload. With the new laws that were being brought in and how oppressive German society became, more people rose up, and many of these were sentenced to death. Many of the condemned people of Plotzensee were executed by a stationary fallbeil or a guillotine. Many prisons had these devices, which were based within their walls, but hangings were also carried out inside the execution chamber. During Hitler's time in power and the Nazi regime, officially on record, 2,891 people were executed by the Berlin State Court and the People's Court. Many of these were executed in Plotzensee, some by axe but the majority by guillotine. From 1937 those condemned individuals were beheaded using a guillotine, taken from Bruchsal prison, which was installed in a work shed near to the prison's walls. The condemned victims would have to walk from their cells into the ground level building where the guillotine was found, and they were then faced by the device that would take their lives. In 1942 in the same building, a beam was placed, which worked as a gallows, where many people could be hanged at one time. Up to 8 victims at the same time could be hanged on this wooden beam, and what was even more shocking was that the condemned individuals' families had to pay for the privilege of their loved one's execution. Each day on death row, in a sense, cost 1.5 Reichmarks, and the execution charge was 300 Reichmarks. Around half of those who were executed at Plotzensee were sentenced to death as they were condemned for carrying out acts of resistance against the Nazis. Some who were condemned included the Red Orchestra. These were a group of anti-Nazi workers who printed anti-Nazi leaflets and propaganda and distributed them to try to encourage people to rise up against them. It was said of some of their executions, when the day of execution was determined, the person convicted for a day or several days was placed in a special cell, a death cell. In the prisons of Plotzensee and Brandenburg, there were cells downstairs that had been turned into death cells. The very fact of being transferred to this cell let the convict know even before the official notification that his hour had come. On the 13th of May 1943, 13 members of the group were executed at Plotzensee. Other members of resistance groups such as the Kreisau Circle were executed there, and 677 prisoners from Czechoslovakia were guillotined or hanged. A number of these were members of the Czech resistance when the Germans occupied their lands, and over 200 death sentences were carried out against Polish members of resistance. 245 death sentences were also carried out against French citizens. Around 300 people who were executed there were women, and following their executions, the bodies of the condemned were then sent for dissection at the Humboldt University of Berlin. One man who was executed there was Berthold Graf von Stauffenberg. He was the older brother of Klaus von Stauffenberg, the man who planted the bomb inside of Hitler's Wolf's Lair. Following the failure of the July 20th plot, He was arrested and was questioned on his views about the final solution. He told the Gestapo that he and his brother had approved initially, but they considered the final solution to be too aggressive and excessive. He later stated, "The racial idea has been grossly betrayed in this war, in that the best German blood is being sacrificed, while simultaneously Germany is populated by millions of foreign workers, who certainly cannot be described as of high racial quality." However, as he was involved in the Stauffenberg plot, he along with 8 other conspirators was hanged inside of the prison. To prolong his death and make it more painful, von Stauffenberg was cut down a number of times from the beam after he was hanged. And then he was hanged yet again after being revived a number of times. This made him suffer longer. His execution was even filmed, and then Hitler watched this back at his leisure to see in his eyes that justice was administered against the people who tried to take his life. Another person to succumb to the execution chamber was Ilse Stoebel. She joined the Communist Party of Germany and was a member of the underground resistance. She was arrested by the Gestapo for allegedly spying for the Soviet Union in 1942. She was then tortured for 7 weeks, where she was forced to confess. She was then sentenced to death for treason and was executed on the 22nd of December 1942 and faced the guillotine, whilst an accomplice was hanged from a meat hook there. It was also a place where criminals and murderers were killed, as Paul Ogazov, the S-Bar murderer and serial killer who killed 8 women inside of Berlin between 1940 and 1941, was killed. He used the blackouts to kill his victims, and following his trial he was sentenced to death. He too faced the guillotine after being declared an enemy of the people. The youngest victim of the Nazi guillotine was executed at Plotzensee and was Helmuth Hubener. He was the youngest person to be sentenced to death for resistance to the Nazis and was just 17 when he was killed. It was unusual for an underage defendant to be condemned, but the court stated he had displayed an adult level of intelligence in his crimes, and because of this he would be killed and punished as an adult. Appeals for clemency were ignored, and at 8:13 p.m. on the 27th of October, he was beheaded by the guillotine inside the execution room. Helmuth Hirsch was also executed there, and he was sentenced to death for his involvement inside of a bombing plot. It's believed his targets were a Nazi headquarters in Nuremberg, and also the plant where anti-Semitic Der Stürmer was printed, but he was arrested by the Gestapo. He was interrogated and transferred to Berlin's prison, and was charged with committing high treason, and he was indicted for possessing explosives with the intent to commit a crime. He was held in solitary confinement, and the newspapers claimed he was trying to assassinate Hitler. There were calls for clemency, however he was condemned to death, and was executed by the guillotine at 6 a.m. on the 4th of June 1937. In the evening of the 3rd of September 1943, an RAF raid damaged the guillotine beyond repair, and parts of Plotzensee were damaged. But because of this, the Reich Ministry of Justice ordered the immediate execution of the condemned people at the prison. Because of this, around 250 people were waiting in rows of 8, where they were hanged on the beam inside the execution cell. The Plotzensee Bloody Knights from the 7th to the 12th of September 1943 executed them, and the killings continued until the 20th of April 1945. But inside of Plotzensee, during Hitler's time in power, around 3,000 inmates and prisoners were executed. It became a large execution site, and a place which was incredibly feared. Many of the executions were carried out swiftly and quickly, but others were carried out to prolong the suffering of a victim. It was a brutal place which deserved the nickname the House of the Dead. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.